DWeb is a kind of very vague, general thing. And I loved how Wendy presented it last night, like at the opening ceremonies. She sort of, in a couple sentences, managed to nail the spirit of it. But what exactly that is and how we'll know if we get it is a bit of a problem for me. So I have a slightly narrower definition. This doesn't cover everything about DWeb, but it is crisp and we'll know if we've got it. And this is what I'm aiming for. And so the first couple minutes I'll be describing that problem, which I'm labeling app freedom is the property that we want, app freedom. And then I'll talk about how to technically get that, or my approach to technically getting that. I think a lot of people, when I describe it, will say that's not possible. And so here's at least my work over the last many years on getting there. So first, I'm going to mention some of the big problems with the internet. And first, I just want to say I love the internet. The internet's great. It's fabulous. You know, just the global culture. You know, things like Wikipedia are absolutely priceless, or Crash Course. Lately, sort of Hank Green is my poster child of the internet, because sort of from Crash Course through to him currently sharing his cancer journey, like just the human story of this is amazing that we can share that. So I don't want to put that down, and I want to sort of, you know, we all love that. That's why we're here. We care about it so much. But of course, the internet has tons of problems. And sort of off the top of my head, the ones that really bug me are when people get unfairly banned from things. Like one of my kids' videos was taken down from YouTube the other day for no good reason. Obviously, the sort of flip side of that is it empowers people to do harm. And that really sucks too. The surveillance, we all know, corrupt algorithms, you know, or algorithmic bias, tuning for outrage, in my mind, is probably the biggest single harm to humanity happening right now, but it's hard to tell. There's all these dark patterns. I asked people what bugs them about the internet, and one of the top things that came up was unwanted UI changes, right? They're using some app and the thing changes under them, and you don't have control over your computer in the current computing world, the sort of internet computing world. And similarly, there's unwanted policy changes, not just UI changes. So I see one underlying problem behind all of that, which is about how each app is kind of, you know, it's its own community, its own database, its own policies, its own police force. And you end up, basically, each one is a fiefdom, it's a kingdom, and it's got these walls to keep you locked in. I mean, not physically, it's not nearly that bad, but still it feels kind of like that. So spiritually, we're locked into these annoying little kingdoms. So social computing is vendor lock-in. It's whenever there is a computing platform where people are interacting, that's social computing, and you're locked in because everybody else, all the value is created inside those walls. We see this so clearly with Twitter the last few years. Like, for different reasons over the last couple of years, different communities have wanted to leave Twitter and claimed they were going to leave Twitter, and by and large, they didn't, you know, because you lose your feed, you lose your followers, you lose your posting history, your conversations, you lose the algorithmic training. Probably most people don't care about that, but you would, and that would suck. And you lose your community, and all of that makes it so it's tend not to want to do that. So we can define the alternative to that, which is app freedom, which is where you could switch apps anytime you want to, use multiple apps at the same time. I think of it as like as easy as you try different salad dressings. You know, you may absolutely love Thousand Island and never use anything else, but that's because you love it. And if you ever stop loving it, you can just try something else, and there's no problem with that. So, like, you know, try 5 different Twitter clones in one day, the same users, the same tweets, everything's the same. Give or take choices they consciously, explicitly make. Like if they add 7 option polls, then those wouldn't match a 4 option poll thing, but only where they don't line up perfectly. That's kind of what I mean by app freedom. And of course, it's not just Twitter. I'm using that as a clear example, but any application that if it bugs you, you haven't switched, it's because you're locked in. And right now, Reddit is a place, you know, the last 2 weeks or so, the internet's all pissed off at Reddit and leaving Reddit, and some of them maybe will, who knows, but there's a whole lot of lock in there. YouTube has had, over the years, all sorts of times where everyone, you know, got up in arms and they were going to leave YouTube, and generally they haven't, because that's where the value is, that's where everyone's locked in. So many different things like that. I'm sure we all have our own examples. So app freedom is this idea that users can move seamlessly between competing apps. You know, the data under the control of the user, not the apps. Relationships are part of the data. Competing apps interoperate, communities cooperate for safety, competitive markets for the apps and for hosting, which I'll get into in a moment. So coming back to my list of problems, would those be addressed? So the first one, unfair bans. I don't have a perfect solution to that, but in this model, users pick their host. And so as long as you can find any host on the internet that's willing to host you, and the internet's pretty big, there's a lot of jurisdictions, I think the unfair bans will be far, far reduced if we can get there. Empowering harms could go far the other way. So we need some tools for community defense, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. That's what makes this, like, a lot of the decentralized projects concern me a lot in terms of empowering harms. Like, a lot of the bad actors haven't really moved into that space yet, but if they ever do in the force they are, say, on Twitter, there's some pretty bad stuff that I expect would happen. So we need something there in any case. Surveillance, again, I don't have a perfect solution. I think removing the surveillance capitalism incentives would help a lot. And letting users pick their own host gives them a lot of tools against it. So I think it removes a lot. I'm certainly not interested in preventing law enforcement surveillance. I feel like there's a real legitimate cause for that, at least sometimes. And there's a lot of trade-offs there. So I'm not saying I'm not checking off each of these things I've got a perfect solution for. But I think it moves it back into a much healthier space. Corrupt algorithms, definitely let users pick their own algorithms. They use the app that, and you might go with the junk food or you might go with the health food. It's kind of up to you. Hopefully we can, as a community, support people into the healthier algorithms. Dark patterns, obviously, you use the apps you like. Dark patterns, you feel the pain when you're using an app like that. And so that seems like a real good answer. Unwanted UI changes, again, you just pick your app. Unwanted policy changes, you pick your app or you pick your host. Between those two, you're probably in good shape, assuming you're not locked in to either of those. So that's kind of the problem statement. I set up this appfreedom.org where I've got a sort of, you can enter your information and I'll sort of keep you on a mailing list as things come along there. So again, that's the problem statement. Now, my sketch of a technical solution. There are 4 parts, as I've been working on this over the last so many years, that I've come across. And I'll name them first, then go into each in more detail. So the first is storing data under user control. I think that's pretty obvious, and we all know that one. Another is having data translators between apps, a network of credibility assessments, or a trust network, or a credibility network, and then a thing called user data sandbox. So data under user control. Here's a diagram I did in 2012 on the cross-cloud project at MIT. The idea here is Alice and Bob are trying to schedule a meeting. They have to pick one particular vendor for meeting scheduling. In this case, they talk to Doodle, and Doodle has its database, right? Each of these things has its little stack of disks, its database. Whereas putting data under user control, the data goes with each user, and they can pick whichever service they want, and they can use different services. So they're not locked in. So Alice can use Doodle on her laptop and TimeBridge on her phone, and Bob can use these other ones, and that all works. That's the vision. That's what I think a lot of people have, we were talking about this a long time ago, and a lot of people have aimed for this. I personally lean towards what I call blog-style decentralization, where you just use web hosts for this instead of some fancy crypto thing. I'm perfectly happy if someone comes up with the ideal crypto solution. That's great. But in my mind, it works fine to just give everybody some web space. And that can be replicated and secure in ways that we know how to do so well already. What's the one protocol that's needed there, I call site query, which is a way to efficiently query and watch for changes across a large number of sites, because I want to aggregate data from lots of different users. So each of these hosts of user data has to run a site query server, and then those can be aggregated. But again, I'm sure there's lots of other people working on decentralized. I know there's lots of other decentralized databases that could work just fine there. Where things get more interesting, and I don't see a lot of people working on this, is data translators. This is the next one. So every application has its own schema, its own shape of data, or its own data format. Lots of different ways to think about this. But even if they have a common database they're talking to, they're both talking to the same Postgres database, they still can't talk to each other unless they use the same schema. So what do you do about that? There's two traditional answers, which are the market leader sets some kind of standard and everybody just follows along grumbling. And every once in a while, the market leader changes something and kills off all their competitors. It's a really bad power imbalance there. And so in a healthy enough market, the followers say, no, we need to turn this over to a standards organization. And this is the kind of work I did at W3C for years. And it's really slow and expensive. Like the social web protocols to sort of take what Twitter does and make that standardized took about 10 years before we finally got those out of W3C. And during those 10 years, there was so much lost, so much opportunity lost, so much centralized in these big companies. And so many applications will never be decentralized in that way because it's just too expensive and too slow. And then even if you get the standard like, iCal or vCard or one of these ICF ones, if you don't like it, how do you change it? If it's not quite good, you're sort of stuck into, well, I guess this is good enough. Or email, right? Email, that works, but when you want to change it, it's very slow and painful. So is there something else we could do? And I propose that there is, which is translation shims. And there's some cost to this, to be sure. People have tried this, but I think with the other pieces in play in this stack of solutions, it can work. So the idea is each app is written to use whatever schema it wants, and it declares very clearly the syntax and semantics of that schema. And then when two apps want to interoperate, some shim code has to be loaded in that converts between the two. And converts from whatever schema it was written with to whatever the reading app wants to load with. And that code runs in some kind of sandbox. It doesn't need access to the disk or all sorts of things. So all it can do is get in the data it's supposed to get and write out the data it's supposed to write out. And you end up with, I think, a really good ecosystem of these shims. We can use a trust network to find shims that seem trustworthy. Not that bad shims can do that much harm because of the sandbox, but still, you'd like a whole ratings and whether they're good. The incentives are in the right place, right? Interoperability between apps. Who is incentivized to make that happen? Often, the apps don't really want to interoperate. It's only the users who want to be able to move between them. The app developers want you to be stuck there, but the shims are outside of their control. As long as the platform required them to document their schemas, then you can write the shims, and then the shims run. So there's private incentives to do this. There could be definitely commercial incentives to develop the shims. I'm kind of intrigued by LLM authoring of shims because they're such small, defined chunks of code. I haven't done that experiment yet, but my guess is even GPT-3 would probably do fine, at least in most cases. I think what's often going to happen is after a while of the sort of wild west of different apps doing different schemas, everyone will sort of go, oh, fine, we'll just use this one. This one looks actually pretty good. So you end up with a de facto standard, and then the shims don't even come into play. You don't have that performance hit, and everybody's happy. But if somebody wants to change it again because they have some new idea, again, they're not, so you want to change vCard after years of being settled in it, fine, you can do that. And then those people will use shims again. So that's step 2, translation shims. Third one, trust networks. My terminology for this is credibility assessment or collaborative credibility assessment. And my picture here is like this wonderful demonstration of how humans work together in a trusting way sometimes. And these towers are usually built in Spain. I don't know if you can see, this one happens to be built in front of the US Capitol, which is an unusual contrast in trust. So my framing of this is that people do credibility assessments. What I mean by that is anytime you come across a source of information or a piece of information, usually unconsciously, you have to figure out whether it's trustworthy. Am I going to trust this or not? And what I want, what the idea here is people share that information with the computer. They put online, I found this source credible, I found it not credible. In general, I find this person credible or this person not credible. And I'm willing to share that with my community because I want to shield them from bad information or let them know this is good information. And hopefully I give some reasons as to why. I mean, it's useful to just say, I find this credible. But it's much more useful if I'm willing to say why and give evidence, like, no, this person is not credible because look at this thing they posted last year, and people might not agree with me, but at least it leads to, I think, a more rational conversation. And we get a credibility graph. I did a demo of this a couple years ago. This is just the panel. So this is somebody rating me, and they flag, they're asked, like, do I know who that person is or not? And they say, no, I'm not sure. Briefly, what experiences most influence how much you trust? Sandro Hawke. And in this case, there's a sort of default sentence that I invited them to the system, so it assumes probably they trust me. Hopefully they edit that a little. And there's this slider from 1 to 99, how much they trust me, with some words labeling it, like high credibility, credible, fair. Some no opinion is right in the middle at 50. And there's also a graphic user interface, a little slightly different from yours, but so in this example, there's a guest who you saw on the blast screen. The guest rated me 85, and then they have visibility into my network, and they see, like, me rating one of my kids 94, and for instance, I gave Pete Buttigieg a fairly high rating, 80, just based on my sense of him on TV, and my kid gave Pete a 40. And so the algorithm ends up giving him a 71 calculated sort of from those numbers. So it's saying, guest, you should trust Pete 71, and unless you say otherwise, right? This is so you can get a credibility score for everybody who's somehow reachable through the network. Yeah. So your ratings let your apps know who to trust when they're working on your behalf. They argue to your community who members in your community should trust. They don't dictate, but they do give evidence there. I believe it creates an ecosystem with a bias towards integrity. And I think that's kind of my favorite thing. Like, if everybody's sharing their sense of other people, then people go, gosh. And so rather than trying to be an influencer and get lots of hits, I'd rather be an influencer in the sense of people trust me. Right? People say I have high integrity. I think that's a better way to go. There's obviously a million human factors here, and I'm not saying I've solved all of those, but I think this is a much healthier direction to go than a lot of other things I've seen out there. So my gut says this is the scalable and safe answer to online trust and safety, right? You can't, Twitter and all the big tech platforms have these massive trust and safety expenditures that behave badly and suffer, and there's all sorts of problems there, and that this is an alternative way to handle that. And I should give credit, the W3C Credible Web Community Group, which is at credweb.org, helped sort of flesh out these ideas a few years ago with funding from Facebook and Google and the Townite Center at City University of New York. One more point on that. I think it was also a great way to prove identity. As we get into the more and more AI bots, people who seem entirely credible and are not people at all, this is a way to make a network of this person met this person face-to-face, who met this person face-to-face, who met this person face-to-face. And that is very strong evidence. The biggest problem I hear about this, and possibly the biggest concern, is that it might well increase division in society. You end up with two completely separate or multiple completely separate groups that don't trust each other at all. That is possible. That's, I think, the biggest concern. However, I think disinformation increases division, and this could cut down on disinformation. It makes it more clear you're in a bubble. You can see explicitly who's in which bubble, and if this person you care about is in that other bubble, maybe you start to go, what was the evidence that ended up there? And maybe you change your mind. I think it can nudge people to operate more rationally. Right now, you make these credibility assessments and you don't write anything down. It's just kind of in the back of your mind, I don't get a good feeling about that. And this way, it's more explicit on paper and hopefully engages more rational parts of the brain, and people make better decisions that way, bringing evidence into the process. And also, if we can get rid of the outrage-driven algorithms or empower them less, that should help too. So I think it's definitely worth a chance. Now onto the fourth point, the user data sandbox. The thing here is that if you want to run apps so all the users have their apps on their own pods or whatever, and then they have their data on their own pods, and then an app runs with that, and it's kind of like the old days of PCs, and you run a piece of software and it has read-write access to all your data, and if it's malicious, you're just totally screwed. And so what can we do about that? So I think the answer is a user data sandbox. Actually, let me hit this second point. The trust graph could help a little bit if the software comes from people who you know in your trust graph. You know, I don't actually know this person, but it's a friend of a friend or a friend of a friend of a friend, and a clearly explicit links. I might actually want to install this software and trust it. Like right now, how many times do you click a box that says, yes, I trust this software, even though you have no reason to? So that helps, but I think sandboxing can work even better. And the idea here, my prototype works by, it runs as a web app. It runs in a narrow web app sandbox, and it has read access to everything you have access to, which is your data and all the data of all your contacts that they've given you read access to. But all it can do with that is put stuff on the screen in its little rectangle that it's allowed to. And it can put actions there, like, send a message is an action, and send a message amounts to, it's putting a change to your data, but it's putting it in as a sort of a new layer of this app at this time is putting this very specific change. And given our schema system from step 2, you know exactly what the semantics of that data are. Like it's not allowed to be obscure. It's not putting a bunch of binary data. It's putting data, and the user could go into sort of paranoid mode every time any app happens. You know, give me a specific panel, pop-up panel saying what the change is happening. More likely, when something goes wrong, you dig down and you see, okay, this app put this data into my database that I don't like, and you can just remove it all because it's all attached to that app. The sandbox did all that labeling. So I think that's pretty safe and practical. Done a few demos, and the performance is not too bad either. So again, those are the four steps. At least for me, I hit them in order, right? Like it seemed, a little bit of history. The first 2 were 10 years ago or so, and then somewhere around 2016, I started to realize that our decentralized stuff, I was working on ActivityPub at the time, and I'm like, and in fact, I think the last ActivityPub or social web working group meeting, face-to-face meeting, was the day after Trump was elected. And suddenly fake news was in all the, that was the phrase everyone was saying, and it was like, are we going to have a problem here? So that's where the W3C credible web work started, and this idea of credibility networks. In the last year or so, this user data sandbox thing has come up as a way to solve some more problems there. So next steps, lots more demoing and stuff to release. As I'm building this mailing list on appfreedom.org, which I encourage you to join if you want to be kept up to date. Really happy to talk to anybody who sees any problems or why this won't work, or partners we should work with. And I think in general, this idea of app freedom, I'd love to see spread a little more, because I think a lot of people, I'm hoping that would be a motivating perspective for a lot of people. So that is it. Actually, I'll leave that slide up. I don't know how much time I have for questions, but there isn't anything next. So if you want to stick around, I'll certainly be here. Questions? Yes.
Okay, so 2 questions.
Yeah.
One is you initially talked about identity portability between things, but I didn't see it in the solution list. And I'm wondering if you've evaluated UCAN and the way AppPhoto's doing it, if you have thoughts about that. And separately, it's nice to have the credibility web, but is it all stored on your server and can it trust you?
So on the first one, yeah, absolutely, mobility between hosts is crucial. I didn't get into that, and that's sort of like a half point on one of these. Yeah, and I'm not super happy with how like Mastodon is doing that. Like it's taking little steps there, but so it's hard and it's absolutely required. You have to let people move between hosts, and kind of encourage them when possible. I mean, I'm a fan of the DNS. I know a lot of people want these sort of identities that are not DNS based. I think the mortal world wants to use the DNS for at least a few more decades. And so in that case, to have really good portability, you've got to have your own domain name, but you can also have forwarding of various sorts. And so I think there's some solutions there. I've played with them. I don't have a solution I'm particularly saying is the right one. I think if you look back in the Mastodon issues, I proposed a solution to them about 7 or 8 years ago that they didn't like.
Well, AppPhoto is using DNS, you know, the blue sky AppPhoto. That's what I was asking you to look at, because they totally
Yeah. I have not dug into that. Yeah. Remind me your second question.
Oh, I was just like, you know,
Oh, right. Why should you trust my server on the credibility stuff? And the answer is, this is why these things are all tied together and not separate, because the credibility data is just more user data. So the credibility assessments people make are like any other app action they take, and they're in their own user pod. It's all in the same database and subject to the same schema mapping system, shims, and in the same sandbox. Like all these pieces fit together pretty tightly.
I like the pieces.
Yeah, and maybe we can find ways to disentangle them. I mean, when I did the credibility work, I couldn't find anyone who I could fit it in with, right? Because you need these pieces to fit together, which is part of why the rest of it came together. So I'm interested in if people have ideas about how to do that. Other questions? Yeah.
Schema mapping normally turns out to be very, very difficult. Like it's very scarcely the case you just have 2 different documents and, well, you know, I just need to change last name to surname and then it works. More often it's the case, like you take that document and you go over to Japan and now Mr. Yamamoto is very surprised you're calling him Yuki. There's subtle differences, if not really large ones, but when you're just missing information that one app demands that the other doesn't, like that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I recognize that history. I guess I'm partly aiming for this ecosystem of people pushing towards each other and having to be very clear about their schemas and explicit. I think a lot of the schema mapping nightmares come from schemas that are not accurate and maintained or explicit, and partly because they're exposed to the user in that dialogue that I talked about in the sandbox. Like the users have to be able to understand what each field is, or a more technical user. It has to be documented there. It's a requirement of the system, and so that's a point that needs to be proven over time, and it's a fair concern. Yeah.
There's maybe better and worse ways to do, like RDF seems to be a data format that's more context free. Like if you say surname, it's going to mean surname, the same thing everywhere.
Yeah.
Have you checked in much with like Solid project?
I was the leader of the Solid project for a couple of years. So yeah.
So is that not a part of a solution here, or how's that?
So but that doesn't solve the vocabulary problem. How do you still have to get people to use the same vocabulary? But yes, to the extent you can get people to use as similar schemas as possible, and if they're all using RDF or something, that helps. I was talking to Tim Berners-Lee over lunch about, he doesn't think this is necessary. He thinks you can just get people to use the same vocabularies, and I don't. And this is the thing. So if you can, great. But if you can't, then we've got this escape hatch of having the translation mechanism. And personally, I think when I'm sitting down to write an app, I actually love to think of it as a green field. I can do whatever schema comes to my mind and is most comfortable for me. So as a weekend hacker, which is a lot of the community I'd really like to appeal to here, because one of the things that's nice about this model is you don't need to run any servers. Like, you can write a piece of code that thousands or millions of people will use without having any operational responsibility. You write it, you publish it, you document the schema, and it could catch on. Probably it will be forked and iterated to really catch on, but each of those steps is kind of small. It doesn't need the same kind of big team and ongoing support commitment that modern software usually does. And with that in mind, being able to not have to design a very careful schema before you start is really nice. You just sort of start hacking and document your schema enough for your users to be able to see their data. That's kind of the feel I'm going for. Other questions?
I'm liking everything you said, and I really want to talk to you more. I've designed over the last several years similar kind of a system that basically approaches the schema and, like what you're calling the translation shims, from the perspective of everything is they're just blobs, and they come from somewhere and they may have some extension, metadata, but basically on the file system, like whatever you get.
So they're binary blobs. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, they may not actually be binary, but you can then,
they're opaque.
Based on what you know about them, you can get, you have a catalog of functions that can extract it. So you can find the schema in terms of what functions, what getters you could say, get what, fields you could say, from that data, regardless of what the blob actually is formatted as. And so you just collect and sort of bag together some things, some attributes that are executable, and you say that's the object that I want to look at. That's your schema. But I'd love to talk more. I mean, it's sort of like that typing, like.
And it seems to me a coin flip decision whether to have completely opaque binary with code attached, or sort of RDF-ish, JSON-ish something with code attached. You do need binary somewhere in there for things like images. So there's a couple different legitimate ways to do that, and I'm not sure what will end up being the best in the long run. So we can definitely talk more.
Personally, I think just remember text is itself binary for format. Like there isn't anything more generic than that, and you have still have your extensions and so on, MIME types to distinguish.
It would be hard to make a principled decision between those two, I think, but maybe you can convince me.
I just say you got everything, and what I designed. I'm gonna shut up because I can ramble.
Yeah, we'll talk. Talk. Any other questions? Okay, yes.
Yeah, when you're talking about trust and having these trust scores, with respect to other users or with respect to the apps?
That was users respecting other users, assessing the credibility of other users.
So there's different kinds of trust.
Actually, let me back up. User accounts, assessing the credibility of other user accounts. It's not actually humans you're assessing. It's really the source of information that is that account, which might be a shitposting account of a perfectly legitimate person, right? So one person could have really high credibility on their main and really low on their shitpost account.
Yeah, so that provides a good example. Because if I follow a parody account, I don't trust them to say the truth, but I trust them to be funny.
Yeah.
And then if I follow someone else for information, I trust them to tell the truth. So there's different kinds of trust. So it's like, well, if you just say, look, we're only going to score everyone on trust to tell the truth, then no one can ever be funny because they'll lose the trust score, right? So, and similarly, do I trust you to tell the truth? Do I trust you to pay me back money that I lent you? Those are two different kinds of trust, right? So you might be good at one and not good at the other. So what does it mean to trust somebody?
Yeah. So I could give an hour-long presentation on that, but the short form, I think of it as let's see if I can get the wording right here. How likely is it that people will benefit from believing what this person says? Like, it's a probability that if they believe what this person says, they will come out ahead versus come out behind.
I mean,
It's truth
I
based.
mean, my answer to that is like we spent about 6 months going for different schemas for trust itself. Like,
Yeah.
what is the schema for the trust claim?
Yeah.
And we used a whole bunch of different like use cases, like real use cases and stuff. And after about 6 months, aspect was one of the fields we kept. We kept source, we kept aspect, we kept an optional rating. So we have a set of minimal fields that I think are useful.
Got it.
Yeah, but obviously there's a whole lot of work you could do there. I think one of the tensions is how complicated it is. Like, I think for most
300
people,
and it's 10 questions for each one. That's 3,000 questions. I'm
yeah,
not gonna do it.
for most people, just a thumbs up or thumbs down, you know, this is a good guy or this is a bad guy,
Right.
is all they're going to ever be willing to do. Or maybe not ever, all they'll be willing to do at first. And then once they start to get engaged in it and care about how the graph looks, then they'll want to tweak and say, yeah, I trust both those people, but they're disagreeing, and I trust this person more than that person because I want this aspect of the disagreement to win. So, but I think we need to do some real experimentation there. And
Thank you all for coming. Round of applause.
thank